what do you understand by policy? Policy is a very, very fuzzy word. People use policy so easily, right? People don't even distinguish what they are talking about, right? Right? What is difference between policy and strategy? What is different between policy goals and policy instruments? What do you mean by the policy in different contexts? Policy means doing something, or policy means not even doing something, also policy, right? When US says that we don't want to do anything about climate change, not doing anything is also policy, right? Policy doesn't mean that we have to always do something. Not doing is also policy, right? Then also when you say policy, okay, our policy is to address climate change very aggressively. That could be also policy, very broad vision kind of policy statement, right? Then you can use very specific policy measures. Okay, we are imposing carbon tax in order to address that. That also policy, right? So I'll come back to later that. That's why you have to distinguish between policy goals, policy statement versus policy measures and policy instruments, right? By the way, I don't know, I should say good news. Just last week, the government of Thailand announced the carbon tax last week. So Thai government announced that they are going to impose carbon tax 200 baht per ton of CO2 emission from all fossil energy from 2025, but 200 baht per ton of CO2, which is hardly $5. So government can use such kind of policy instruments. Now, that's why in policy, usually first what you need is very clear policy statements or policy objectives, right? We do something, we don't do something, we want to achieve something, so you need a policy objectives, right? These policy objectives can be specified with a numerical target even. Let's say nationally determined contributions, NDCs of the country, renewable energy target of the country, like, meeting SDG target, this one, that. So these could be a indicator, but also very clear policy instruments. Then in order to meet your policy objective, you have lots of options, right? You can do X, you can do Y, you can do Z, or you have to do X, Y, Z together in different combination, right? You have lots of options. So there is need to identify options for implementation of the actions which will actually meet your objectives, policy objectives. There could be technological options, behavioral change options, and every options comes with the costs, benefits, every option, right? Then you have to, now, if you see, okay, we are going for this option, then now when you say these are the options, it's a question of what do you do? Then the next question is how do you do it, right? How do you do it? You say that, okay, we are going to using electric vehicles as we use electric vehicles to meet the climate objective in transport sector, right? Okay, what do you do is, okay, we promote electric vehicle, but how do you do it? How, right? Now the question of the how means now you have to address policy instruments or specific policy measures. You can say that, okay, we are giving subsidy to the electric vehicles. Now that is a policy instrument or policy measures. If you say that we are going to tax normal vehicles more, we are going to tax more fuel, more tax on the fossil fuel. These are the specific policy measures, right? So in order to meet your policy objectives, you have to use several policy instruments in combination, which will finally meet your policy objectives on the top, right? So what I'm trying to show here is that don't get confused about this very broad word policy. You have a policy, you have a visions, policy statements, what you want to achieve, aspirational policies. Then you have lots of options to meet that policies. Then in order for these options to actually work, you need a question like, okay, how to do it? Then you have to use specific policy instruments or specific policy measures like a taxes, subsidy. Those are usually, we call it policy instruments or policy measures, right? So sometimes policy word could be very confusing if you really do not clarify what exactly you are talking about. Now, but understand that policy choices are shaped by the complex negotiation between the policy implementer and the stakeholders, right? Because any policy for your option is good, but the policy instruments, which policy instrument is good, you have to consult with the stakeholders, right? You have to consult with the stakeholders, because ultimately you have to implement that policy, and the feasibility depends on the local reality. Your capacity, acceptability by the stakeholders, right, is very important, because if the stakeholder dynamic didn't work, your policy doesn't work. Because for implementing any policy, somebody will lose and somebody will gain, right? So that's why in real life, we researchers would like to see very optimal, theoretically optimal policy. But in real life, it's not like that. In real life, policy is made by the collective bargaining or the collective acceptability by different stakeholders, right? So that's a reality. Theoretically, optimum policies are rarely implemented. You have to negotiate that range of the good policies with the stakeholders. Then at the end, personally, I'm very happy if the second best or the third best policy is implemented in real life, right? So these are very important aspects, right? Now, because policy compliance, again, depends on stringency of policy instrument versus the acceptability of stakeholders. If you make policy too strong, right, it doesn't work. If the stakeholder don't accept it completely, it's very difficult to work. So stringency, again, if you make too loose policy, you will not meet your policy objective. If you make too strong policy, there may not be compliance because the stakeholder, too much for stakeholder. So you have to always fine-tune policy. So your ability to enforce your policy usually depends on stringency of policy instruments versus acceptability by stakeholders. So the public policy making is a very, different ball game altogether. It needs very strong governance. It needs very strong political will. It needs infrastructure to support your policy implementation, and it needs the capacity to implement policy instruments, right? So policy is a complex field. So I earlier said that there are so many different options that they are in hand of the government, right? Government's provisioning, making rules, policies, innovation, range of things. So generally, when you say that policy instruments, we usually divide policy instruments into different types. One very prominent type is regulatory policy instruments. Second one is fiscal policy instruments. Third is market-based policy instruments. Fourth, voluntary information policy and R&D policy. These are very standard classification of the policy, the types of the policy instruments. You know very well what is regulatory policies. All standards are regulatory policies, right? All standards are example of regulatory policy. For example, vehicle emission standard, vehicle fuel efficiency standard, technological standards for the coal-fired power plant, right? And also similarly, such standards are, there could be two. One is, standards, other is regulation, performance standard, or the technology standards. Standard can be two types of, standards. Performance standard versus technology standard, right? So for example, if you want to control, let's say, air pollution, right? Okay, let me go back to the case of New Delhi in India. Around 30 years back, New Delhi was very much polluted. New Delhi, right? Then there is a so-called public action litigation by the environmental lawyers. That idea is that, government didn't do enough, then they went to the Supreme Court of India, right? Then the Supreme Court, it's called public litigation, right? Then the Supreme Court of India passed a directive, gave an order to the government of Delhi that all the public vehicles, buses and others in New Delhi must be converted to CNG vehicles, right? So court gave some kind of direction, and that time directives. That time there was a lot of debate that some people say that the court is wrong, because courts should say that any vehicles with this much emission standard, they should fix on emission outcomes but not technology. Some people say that, okay, why the court is fixing CNG vehicles, right? Then there are some other arguments saying that, okay, court proposed CNG argument vehicle because if we want to rely on technology, maybe implementation or enforcement is difficult, right? Who is going to check? And the whole mechanism is very weak. That's why if you really fix the technology, then that's much easier to do. So what I'm trying to give example here is that performance standards versus technology standards. So you can do in two way, right? So let me give you example, of the regulatory policy instruments. For example, greenhouse gas standard for vehicle. If you go to European Union, they have set how much CO2 emission per kilometer is allowed by the vehicle manufacturers, right? So, for example, the EU regulation says that in 2025, 2030, there's a 15% reduction from 2025 onwards for both cars, and 37.5% reduction from 2030 onwards, and within 2021 to 24, they have to have 95 grams of CO2 per kilometer, right? So that means you impose that regulation on the vehicle manufacturers. Now the vehicle manufacturers must produce that kind of car, right? Similarly, fuel efficiency standards. And when the Obama was president, Obama also provided, several, Obama era greenhouse gas standard for the power companies, especially which basically says that you have to either move to natural gas power plant, and without carbon capture and storage, you really cannot operate a coal-fired power plant. So there are lots of such kind of standard. As I said, could be a performance standard, could be the technology standards, right? These are the regulation. So basically, regulation means command and control, essentially. Lucky Moni earlier said that controlling. This command and control is a fundamental example. Then also there are lots of other examples. Those of you who work for energy sector know very well things like renewable portfolio standards. Government is saying that government is telling to power company that 30% of your electric cell must be renewable energy, right? So the amount of energy they sell, right? So 30% must come from renewable energy. So government, and that renewable portfolio standards is a very standard policy used all over the world now. Similarly, you have an energy efficiency resource standard. Similarly, you have a public benefit fund, appliance equipment energy efficiency standards, net metering, net billing. So there are lots of such regulatory policies which really impose. There is no choice. Utility companies must need to meet those regulatory requirements. These are examples of the regulatory policy instruments. Generally, taxes, subsidies, these are the price control mechanism called fiscal policies, right? So fiscal policy means, you impose carbon tax. I told you that Thai government imposed from 2025, it will be effective 200 baht per ton of CO2. And now Singapore was the first country to impose carbon tax in Southeast Asia. They had a 5 Singapore dollar per ton of CO2 in from January 1st, 2019. Now from January 1st, 24, they have raised it to 25. And they have a plan to raise to 45 in next few years. So Thailand also is starting with a $5 per ton, and hopefully Thailand will also raise carbon tax in the future. So, but there are many different kind of taxes, charges, even subsidy is part of the policy instruments, right? Providing subsidy, so subsidy can be done in so many different ways, either direct payments, tax reductions, feed-in tariff, accelerated depreciation, incentives, direct incentives. There are a range of such policies exists. I gave many examples, mostly from the energy, but similarly, you have many such examples from other sectors also, agriculture sector, transport. And there are lots of such taxes, such fiscal policy instruments used in different sectors. And these are some of the examples of the carbon tax in practice. Indonesia announced the carbon tax, but Indonesia keep on pushing, and they have not been able to fix the implementation date, and they keep in delaying the implementation date, although they announced in 2021, but they keep on pushing. But Thailand has said that from 2025, as you can see on the screen here, they have. So similarly, Singapore already raised to 25 Singapore dollar from 2024. So these are important, fiscal policy instruments. Then the other kind of policy instruments is market-based policy instruments, right? So when you say market-based policy instrument, then we provide flexibility and let market to find its one optimal solution, and government do not impose anything by themselves. They set the framework and let market to compete and come up with the efficient solution themselves. One very clear example of the market-based policy instruments widely used in the context of climate change is the emission trading system, right? So emission trading is a market-based policy where the government caps the total amount of the CO2 emission that is allowed within that territory or within that sector or within that defined bubble. Then each emitting units within that bubble can emit less or more, but they have to be in total within certain cap, and they can sell and buy their emission rights with each other, so that then the price of that carbon commodity emission rights depends on demand and supply. Then over the years, government can reduce the cap, and they have to be within that cap. So that means you provide flexibility in the market. Some company can reduce CO2 emission at low cost. Some companies cannot. So the company which cannot, they will buy emission rights that from the other companies where the marginal cost is very less, but the total emission is same, right? So you allow market to buy and sell and create some. Then the market will find its own efficient system, but they will be within the limit, right? So those kind of emission trading system is quite common, and there are many such systems already placed around the world. So how the emission trading system happens? Let's say government sets a cap that, let's say, power sector, saying that all the power companies, their total CO2 emission cap is this much amount. Government fixed the cap. That cap can be reduced over the time, maybe reduce 2% reduction every year. So government defines the cap, right? Then government provides emission rights to different emitting entity within the cap, right? Then those company at the end of the year need to surrender emission permits equivalent to their actual emission, right? Then if they emit less, then they have surplus emission rights, right? Some company, if they emit more, right, then they can buy emission permits from the other company, which is reducing emission more than their emission rights. But the total cap is, everything is within the cap. So that means, let's say company X can reduce emission at very high cost. Company Y can reduce emission at very low cost. Then company X can buy that rights from emission rights, from company B, because company B actually reduce emission, but at much less cost. Then at the end of the year, based on their actual emission, they have to surrender permission quota. They have to, this emission rights allowances, they have to submit at the end of the year in order to for them to perform. If not, there's a heavy penalty. So the idea here is that market can, in the market, they have a market mechanism. Company can buy and sell those permits depending on their actual emission situation, right? Government sets the cap, government issue permits, government can do a free allocation, or they can auction the permits. If government wants to make money, they can even auction the permits, right? Then the company can trade with each other. There could be also flexibility to some offset also. Then at the end, that bubble, those companies together, the total cost is less, right? Because some company which cost is very high, they don't need to do that. They can buy at cheaper rate from the other company, which has potential to reduce CO2 emission at low cost. But again, idea is that the total cap is maintained. So cap, how to set a cap, how much to set a cap is very important. That cap can be reduced over time so that they can become more and more efficient. So this is a kind of market mechanism. I mean, there are several ETS, emission trading systems. You can explore around how it works. The most prominent one is European Union emission trading system. Almost 45% of the Europe's total emission is capped under European Union emission trading system. California has a very, very elaborate cap and trade system. Almost 80 to 85% greenhouse gas emission from California is capped. So Japan, city of Tokyo has a emission trading system. City of Saitama in Japan has an emission trading system. South Korea has an emission system. So basically, emission trading systems are all around. So this is a map of carbon pricing, right? This is a carbon taxes and emission trading system. Here you see that there are many countries around the world which has either carbon tax or emission trading system. Carbon tax is a fiscal policy instruments, and carbon emission trading system is a market-based policy instrument. Even China has a nationwide cap and trade system in China. So you can see that it's not something new. We have been using such policy instruments quite efficiently for some time. Globally, around 23% of the global greenhouse gas emission is under some kind of pricing regime. Price is low, but still that are price. You can see the map of carbon tax and emission trading system. So basically, we have such system in many countries, many cities around the world, right? So anyway, you can explore more. For example, now other interesting, the market-based system also is developed in India. It's called PAT, Perform, Achieve, Trade. This is not for CO2 emissions, but this is for the energy efficiency. Every designated entities have to meet certain energy efficiency benchmark. If they overachieve, they can sell their energy efficiency. They're over the benchmark. They can sell and buy to others. Energy saving certificate system in India, right? So this is also market-based approach, but the regulatory sets up the frame. Then the private sector can actually work. So I will not get into too much detail into the individual tools, but you can look at some of the slides and you can explore more by yourself. Then there are other kind of policy instruments called voluntary policy instruments, right? The government use that. So basically, government agree with certain business associations. Then business associations themselves come upfront and they voluntarily do without government making rules and regulation. So those voluntary agreements are also important policy tools. But some people sometimes argue that voluntary policy instruments are not really truly voluntary. That is pushed by the government in lieu for legislation, or that is pushed by business association to avoid the legislation from the government, right? It could be both ways, but in any case, voluntary agreements are also common. You can see a range of different voluntary agreements done historically. For example, European automobile agreements, Canadian automobile agreements, Japan's KEDA-REN voluntary action plan. They're especially business associations come up with their own voluntary initiatives. But some people say that business associations do it because they want to avoid stringent regulation, and they want to commit something themselves, relatively less stringent, and somehow they find still to do a business rather than government being too active and pushing them. So, but of course, there are different levels, different kind of arguments, but the voluntary agreements are also important policy instruments used around. Then the other important policy instrument is information-based policy instruments, right? Now, information is very important because we have to empower people to make a right decision. Especially for the consumption is very, very important, right? For example, if you go to market, let's say you want to go to market and you want to buy air conditioner, right? You have one air conditioner which looks little cheaper right? But its running cost is very expensive. Over the lifetime of the air conditioner, actually over the life cycle cost is actually higher, but the initial market price is low. Then you have other air conditioner. Initially, it looks more expensive than the other one, but over its lifetime, it's more efficient. Its cost is less. So life cycle cost is less. But when consumer don't know, consumer cannot do calculation. Consumer go to the market and consumers see that, oh, we have two air conditioner. This is more expensive. This is less expensive. So consumer do not have no idea about the full cost of the life cycle cost, right? So for example, in that case, if you allow consumer that information, then consumer can make right decision. Consumer will buy products which is cheaper in the life cycle cost terms, or even if expensive, consumer are environmentally conscious. They say that, okay, compared to this air conditioner is little expensive, but it's environmentally friendly. I'm willing to pay a little bit higher money and I'll buy it. So we have to empower people to know all this information, right? So information disclosure is very, very important aspect. For example, if you go to Japan, if you go to buy air conditioner, refrigerator, they must display cost in Japan. There's a government regulation, right? And also, we have something called energy level, right? In different equipments, you have an energy level that shows you how efficient is that product, right? So this energy leveling is a very, very important. Similarly, we have such leveling system even for carbon footprint in Europe. For example, if you go to Europe, sometimes in the back of the product is written, carbon footprint, right? So idea here is that things like leveling programs, rating and certification system, you empower people so that the people can make right decision, right? Because as you said, that sustainability is a big goal, right? So without doing the behavioral change is very, very difficult, right? Now, in order to do behavioral change, we have to empower people with information, give them right information about right cost, or even if a little more expensive, maybe people are willing to do that, right? So information instrument is a very, very important instruments for policymakers to make aware. Now, the other policy instrument I already mentioned is R&D, because in many cases, especially for sustainable development, there are a lot of technology, right? A lot of technology which needs to emerge in the future. In order to meet sustainable development, what are the technologies we have, right? Which technology right now we can upscale, or which technology need to improve performance and cost in the future? If we identify that, government can invest money in R&D for those technologies so that this technology can improve in the future, or government put some seed money for R&D to the private sector, then government supplements some of the cost, private sector puts some cost, and you empower private sector and you support them with some seed resources to do a technological innovation, right? So that's why every country has innovation policy, science and technology development policies. So these are very, very important aspects, especially for the SDG, because the role of technology is very, very important, right? In order to meet SDGs. Now, there are also a lot of new emerging concepts, and there are a lot of things. Maybe you have heard a lot about circular economy, right? At the moment, we live in very linear world. You extract resources, you make a product, you consume a product, you throw it, and it goes to the garbage, and there's a huge problem for managing waste. So our economy is not circular. Even the industrial functions are all, it's a uniform, one directional. It's not a circular system. Output waste from the one industry can be used as an input to the other industry, right? Waste from certain industry can be recycled and really go to the other processes. So if we create circular economy, that applies to everything, even the house construction, right? Can we design the modular house so that the things can be circular? Things can be replaced easily, or things can be used by someone else. So there are a lot of things about the circular economy. and the material cycle, so that the resource consumption could be addressed. So these are a very important aspect for sustainable development, because resource consumption, not only CO2 emission, but the resource consumption is a very, very important aspect. So we have to move away from make kind of throwaway kind of concept to more circular concepts, right? And we have to do that structurally at different level, not only waste recycling. That's too small. That waste recycling is a very, very small part of the bigger idea of circular economy, right? Circular economy means that the whole economy performs optimally in terms of resources. So, I put few YouTube videos there. Maybe you can look in the detail, but how to do circular economy, right? So there are a lot of important aspects which are important, and I would like to discuss that. What I was mentioning is about the circular economy, right? I hope that you appreciate the fact that circular economy is very important. Efficient use of global natural resources is, very, very important. In 2020, you'll be surprised that we have reached 100 billion tons of material enter global economy. So in 1 year, to the 2020, we extracted 100 billion tons of resources, right? So if we keep on growing, and if we're consuming the same rate with more and more population, then the earth becomes difficult place, right? Not enough. So at the moment, the global economy in terms of resources is not circular. Only hardly 8.6% is circular. All others are linear, right? Use and throw kind of situation we are in. Now, in order to promote the circular economy, a material cycle is very important, right? Just look at iPhone 13, right? The carbon footprint of the iPhone 13 life cycle carbon footprint is 69 kilogram of carbon emission. Of course, it depends on how you charge your iPhone, then what kind of electricity, what is the carbon emission factor of the electricity in which you charge your iPhone. It matters, but the 69 kg of carbon emission must have been taken in the global average carbon emission factor of electricity. So you can see that in order to make an iPhone 13, they use now better material, 99% recycled tungsten, 98% recycled rare earth elements, 100% packaging of the iPhone 13 Pro comes from recycled wood fibers. 95% of the packaging is fiber-based, and also 54% less energy consumed than US Department of Energy requirement for battery charging system. So iPhone is much efficient system. At least this is what they claim. And also, if you look at emission, you can see that out of that 69 kilogram of carbon emission, 89% emission happens at the production level. Only 12% is use level. That means the charging your mobile phone, other things, only 12%. So almost 84% happens there. And also, how much material is used, you can also find some details of this. So what I'm showing is that recycling is very important, and creating circular economies so that materials are recycled, and we move away from this so-called linear economy is very, very important. Now, there are lots of ways through which such circular economy is possible, either from technological side or on the biological side. Things like, recycle, reuse, redistribute, refurbish, prolong the life of the products. This can be done on the technical side, right? On the biological side, you can regenerate, you can do a lot of, anaerobic digestion of the, those, organic ones, extraction of the biochemicals, feedstock. So there are lots of things are possible to do at many different levels. It's not simply recycling, right? Recycling of the waste is just a small concept, right? There is much more bigger circular economy is possible on technical side as well as biological biological side. If you look at this slide, this is a material flow for Southeast Asia, right? ASEAN countries in 2018. You see that the recycling and the circularity is very, very low here, right? When you see the small line, the blue color line at the end, this is recycling. So recycling of the end of the life waste is 2.5%, and the circularity is hardly 0.8% here. Circularity means that this is 0.07. What you see here is between these two parameters, right? So what I'm trying to show here is that the material extraction on your left, there is a lot of losses in the system, and the things gets used, but very less is recycled. Very, very less recycled. It's not a matter of only waste recycling. In terms of waste recycling, around 2.5% of it is the waste recycling. But the whole throughput of the material system itself is hardly 0.8% in ASEAN. But if you compare the European Union, for example, the recycling rate of the end of life waste is 27.3% in European Union, and the circularity is 7.5% in European Union. So there is much to do. Of course, I'm not saying that Europe is better. Europeans need to do even better. But I'm trying to show here is that our material cycle is very, very weak, very, very weak. And there is so much things we need to do in order to create circularity in the economy. Actually, if you are interested, similar flow chart is there for a number of ASEAN countries.